Hi, this is a short little video about my house painting project. In particular, I have a house that has peeling paint, or had peeling paint, and how I decided to deal with that. Now, first thing, whenever you're dealing with peeling paint, you need to deal with the possibility that there is lead there. You really absolutely need to do a lead test. If there's no lead, it's pretty straightforward. If there is lead, it's a special approach is required. Luckily, I had no lead in my paint. So about the house, built in the late 1970s, about 2,500 square feet. The siding is cedar clapboard. It probably needed a paint job when we bought it in about 2000. On the south and west exposures, where it sees a lot of sun, the paint was heavily deteriorated. And this is the south exposure. And there's a close-up of what the paint looked like. And you can see it varies from paint that's pretty deteriorated to no paint at all. And looking at this, all of that has to come off. You simply, even the stuff that kind of looks like it's real paint, it's deteriorated, and if you put new paint on it, it would go right off. So this is not a restoration. I'm not trying to make the house look perfect. I'm trying to get the siding back to an acceptable state. If I wanted a restoration, if I wanted it to look really nice, I should have torn all the siding off and re-sided it and gone from there. But that's not the goal here. So, how can you take the paint off? Well, there's some infrared approaches. This is the Speed Heater Standard 1100. You kind of put it over a section of paint for about 20 to 60 seconds and scrape it off. It's about $600. There's a competitor, the Silent Paint Remover, about $400. I think these were the same company at one time, and it looks like they've had some legal discussions. This looked pretty pricey to me. Looked interesting, but looked pretty pricey. Shaving is a mechanical approach. So you have the Paint Shaver Pro at the top. They claim you can do about 1 square foot in 30 seconds. It's about $650 to start for their simple kits. Metabo also makes a paint shaver as well, slightly cheaper. You can try a normal heat gun, kind of the simple version of the infrared, although you're using hot air rather than infrared. They're cheap. There is some fire danger. If your wood's fairly wet, fairly dry, and you heat an edge too much, you can actually catch it on fire. And this is likely to take a long time. You can also do a chemical approach, something like Smart Strip. It's relatively inexpensive, I guess. $250 for 5 gallons, which would probably be enough for my house. You have to put tarps out and do all other sort of stuff and do that. And if you're just trying to take paint off, that might be a good approach. Since I had a bunch of deteriorated wood, I'd have to sand it anyway. And finally, there's scrape and sand. So carbide paint scraper to do the scraping, and then something like a random orbit sander. So pretty cheap. And what I did is I got out my heat gun, which I already owned. It really didn't work well. Basically, the paint was so bad in most places that it just kind of came off. You didn't have to break the bond of the paint with the wood. I tried the sander, and that worked fine. And scrape and sand was my choice. It also turned out that I really actually didn't need to scrape. That sanding by itself just worked fine, and it did less damage to the wood. So sand is really the approach I took. So tools. The Makita orbital sander plus a big stack of paper. That worked pretty well, except you see that little bag for the sawdust. That filled up in about 15 minutes. And then you have to take it out and try to vacuum it out with your shop vac. That did not work very quickly. So I went with the Makita vacuum adapter, a little hose you attach, and then that attaches to your shop vac. And that worked pretty well. You have to deal with the hose, but it's not bad. That would fill the shop vacuum in about an hour or so. But unfortunately, lots of really fine dust, and that means you have to spend time cleaning out the filter. And that's a pain and just takes a lot of time. And then I did some research and bought this thing. And this is a Oneida Dust Deputy Kit. And this is a cyclonic dust separator. Basically on the upper right of that cone at the top, there's a suction, there's a tube inside, so the whatever you're suctioning in swirls around the outside of the cone, and it slows down and it falls into the bucket at the bottom, and then the air goes out the top into your shop vac. This was ridiculously effective. I was amazed. Easily more than 90% of the dust gets separated out and ends up in the bucket. That means not only do you have to change things less often, because it's a pretty big bucket, it's a 5-gallon bucket, but it means your filter doesn't get clogged, so the suction runs higher for much longer. On that one side of the house I showed you, I filled this bucket about 3 times. So there's a lot of material that came off. This was very, very useful, and I feel stupid that I didn't buy one of these a long time ago. Anything that generates a lot of things, like if you have a planer, which I do, this would be great for it. Other sanders. So the Random Orbit was my main sander. I also have a Milwaukee small, an M12 brushless oscillating multi-tool that I attached the sanding pad to. And that actually worked really good for the areas the orbital didn't fit. It is quite a bit slower, even with good paper, and there's no real dust collection. You can hold the vacuum hose near it, and that works, but you're still going to end up with quite a bit more dust. I also bought one of these. This is called a detailing file sander from Win. It's really just a half-inch belt sander. This was really nice to get behind obstructions. There were some places where the Random Orbit and the brushless, the multi-tool would not fit, and that long nose let me reach way back there. It's not very wide, and it can dig in pretty easily, so it's easy to damage wood with. Some of those areas don't look very good, but as I said, not a restoration. And then finally, there's an old Craftsman quarter sheet palm sander I have, older than this one, and I use that a bit in some areas too. PPE. So if you're doing this, get yourself a dust mask with a valve, a real dust mask, not just one of these paper ones. You will be around particulate for long periods of time, and you do not want to breathe it in. Over the ear hearing protection, leather gloves here. I think these might be deerskin. Safety glasses, well, they're not shown because I'm wearing them when I took the picture. I use bifocal ones. That lets me see a little better on the close-up stuff, and there's a lot of detail work here. I also had some Bluetooth headphones that I wore underneath the hearing protection. You're going to be out there a long time, and being able to listen to music or podcasts was very, very helpful. Scaffolding. If you have any height at all, and you can see on this side here, not only do I have 2 stories, but it goes from like 1.5 stories to 2 stories. This will allow you to move faster and make your work much, much safer. You do not want to be up high on a ladder with a sander. It's just not a great place to be. If you rent these, this triple stack here would probably be out about $250 a month. I actually borrowed some from a friend in exchange for some welding work. So scaffolding, definitely recommended. Approach. So how are we going to do this? Well, basically what I did is I worked on a small section, about 8 by 8 at a time. So get it all ready for paint, put on the primer, and then move on to the next section. And here you can see I worked top to bottom. Something you'll notice on the right is even if you work top from bottom, even with your dust collection, you are going to get dust all over the place. And you're going to have to be able to sweep and spray the dust off the siding at the end. I had a little brush that I'd use to brush off, and I also got out my air compressor and blew it off near the end. Something that you can't see here, but is interesting to talk about, is up high underneath the eaves, the paint was just fine. And so I'd kind of go up and keep sanding the paint off until I got to a part that really didn't want to sand off, and that's where I'd stop. So started with pressure wash. This was mostly to remove the dirt from the eaves and the other parts that weren't flaking. The parts that I was going to sand off, I didn't want to pressure wash too much, and I was sanding it all off anyway. Before you sand, you need to put the nail heads so they're under the final surface. Unfortunately, you really don't know where the final surface is. Some of the wood is not deteriorated very much, and some is pretty deteriorated. So you'll be sanding off different amounts. So kind of make a guess there, and you may have to come back and set some of them a little bit more when you start sanding a board. And then a lot of this. A long time over and over and over. And you're just going to be sanding a lot. This is pretty typical of what the wood looked like on that side. Now you notice that it started with a rough texture. That's the original finish. And when I sand down, I end up with a fairly smooth texture. And that's what I mean. It's not a renovation. It's not all going to match. It's not all going to be perfect, but it's going to have a good solid coat of paint on it at the end. Replacement. There are a few spots that look like this. You notice we have a big knot here, and you may not be able to tell. Not only is it broken away, it's actually sticking out. And these sections need to be replaced. So luckily that oscillating multi-tool, you can put a blade into it. So I'd cut back to a stud, the actual wood, and then cut the nails with the multi-tool. And you would both cut the nails from this piece of siding, the one you're replacing, and the piece of siding above it. And then you can kind of work it out. You may need to use another small saw to kind of get the piece loose, and then you can replace it with new siding. My local lumberyard had something that was pretty close, at least after I ended up sanding down. Sanding down took away a little of the thickness that the wood had originally. And then you just replace it with the new siding. Knot holes and cracks. There were a lot of these on the south side. You'd see knots. There's a little knot here in this picture, and this is kind of a tight knot. It's still attached, but the edge isn't very nice. You would also find knots that were loose or had fallen all the way out, and then you had a bunch of cracks here like that. And you could deal with these with more of a spackling compound, but I didn't want to do that because I figured this wood is going to get hot and cold and it's going to shift again. And if I just spackle it, it's probably not going to hold very well. So what I did is I patched with a mix of epoxy and sawdust. Epoxy plus wood is what's known as thixotropic, which is a big word that means that it does not sag and run out. So you get a nice mixture. You can press it into holes and stuff, and it will just sit there. It doesn't run away. If you have wood dust, like if you sandwood ever. The stuff that comes out of your belt sander bag is perfect for this. It's a little better than sawdust, but sawdust will work as well. And put it into the crack with a putty knife and leave a bit extra to sand off. Note that this is going to be kind of hard to sand, so you don't want to leave too much. I would generally do this the last thing in the day. Typically, as usual with epoxy, you don't want to mix too much because it has a limited time that you can do it, and you want to wear gloves. I used West Systems products because I had some leftover from some other fiberglass projects I've done. This sort of epoxy is pretty liquid, so you definitely need the wood to add to it and to make it thicker. Some of the other epoxies that you might get might be a little more gel-like. You could probably use those directly. It's nice to add the wood partly because it's a little more wood-like, and partly because epoxy is expensive and the wood will bulk it up quite a bit. And then finally you get to a state like this, and this is a state where I have everything done, the boards are replaced, and all I have left is spackling and caulking. So you remember I had a bunch of nails that I set, so I'm going to use spackle to fill in the nail holes, small holes, anything else that's not smooth. So we're just trying to make the surface a little nicer. I used plastic wood X for this. That seemed to work pretty well. It goes on pink and then dries white. I really didn't need that, but I guess it's kind of cool. I guess it is useful when you're doing a large area like this. You can look around and see which parts of the wall you have already caulked, and it's useful for that. For real caulking, around the windows, between the window and the trim, and then between and the siding, and then any other penetration through the siding. You'll see here there's a couple electrical penetrations, and then there's a gas line coming in as well. I used Dynaflex Ultra. It doesn't pay to go cheap on caulking, and I really didn't need that much. So I think I used 2 or 3 tubes for the whole house. It was in actually pretty good shape because the windows were relatively recent. And then finally we get to paint. And I used 2 coats of Sherwin-Williams Duration on the body. I used 2 coats of super paint on the gutters and trim. Duration was not available because of COVID. Probably $1,200 in paint, something like that. Good paint is not cheap. And there's a picture of the paint if you care. I sprayed the body with a Graco Pro 210 ES. Having a real sprayer here was really useful. This was borrowed from a friend. If I didn't borrow it, I would have bought a sprayer, probably not one quite this nice, but I would have bought a sprayer and then sold it on eBay. The interesting question is, can you rent? And you can rent. Note that it takes quite a while to do a bunch of painting. And what I did is I did the house in thirds. So I did all of the prep, all the priming, and then painted the final coat and the trim on 1/3. And then I do the next third, and then I do the final third. And I did each of those. I shot 2 of the coats. The base got 2 coats in a single day. So a couple hours in the morning to shoot it, and then let it dry for a few hours, and then come back and shoot another coat. And that worked very well. Siding and gutters, all painted 2 coats by hand. Trim and gutters, 2 coats by hand. And the project overall, elapsed time, this took a long time. And I did it essentially part-time. So for about 6 weeks, pretty much without a gap, maybe 1 or 2 days off, I would get up, I'd try to be out by 7:30 or 8, since it was the summer, and I'd work a few hours until I got a good part done, and it got hot. If you were doing sanding, it's going to take, just inherently, it's going to take a long time. And by far the sanding was the big bulk. I didn't have to replace that many boards, so that didn't take that long. And I didn't really have to do that much patching with the epoxy. So everything else didn't take that long. Because I had scaffolding where when I moved the scaffolding on the side, that was kind of a big operation. And I had another side of the house where I had to do the same thing. And that was also takes a fair bit of time. For the back, the scaffolding was on wheels, and that's flat. So, if you do want to see some before and after pictures, so here's the one of that really bad section. This is what it looked like before, and that's what it looked like after. If you look on the right, you can see the replacement board for the one with the big knot in it, but you can also see that it's not really that obvious. It looks pretty much the same. A little bit nicer, but not that much difference. And then here's the view from the side before and after. So you can see overall you get back a little bit, and that ended up with a nice, clean, similar finish, which was really what I was after. And then here's just kind of another gratuitous shot of the back of the house. So that's the project. I hope it was useful for you. Thanks for your attention.